All right, Joe, let's talk about fighting sin. Again, for another week. We've been doing this for several weeks in a row as we are focusing this season of the Cross Training Ministries podcast all on teaching guys, training guys, and how to fight back against sin, giving them rules of war for how to go about doing this. So we've talked about playing good defense, playing good offense, creating good, healthy habits in your life. And today we're going to talk about something called the law of replacement. But before we jump into it, you were telling me you got a story of a garden that you wanted to introduce this by. So I want you to go for it.
Yeah, well, this isn't a personal story. I guess it's more of a parable. I do like a vegetable garden. I'm not very good at it, but I'm better than this story. So,
okay.
The image I want to leave with guys is I want you to imagine that you decide you want to grow a garden, and so you go out, you clear a plot of land, you pull weeds, and you till the soil, and you just kind of sit and you watch. And every few days, you go out and you pull a few more weeds. And you just do that for not just weeks, but months at a time. And guess what? At the end of that process, you will find that you have no vegetables. I mean, it's kind of an obvious point. But what's ridiculous is that's the approach most guys take to fighting sin. So we think of it as, so what we're meant to do is we're meant to kill sin. And so I'm going to watch my heart. I'm going to try to identify sin. I'm going to try to kill it, when actually the whole process is about something bigger than just plucking up weeds. Like, this is part of growing in holiness. And what we ultimately need to realize as men is that no sin's going to go away unless it's actually replaced, unless something is put into the ground in the place where that weed was growing and grows instead. And so, that's what we're going to talk about today, is just how do we not just think about what we're meant to kill, but what we're actually meant to cultivate.
That's a great image, the garden there. I definitely am that gardener in a lot of ways. I'm not a great gardener. I've had a garden before, but yeah, spent a lot of time pulling weeds and not focusing on actually growing the vegetables and setting the soil. A good gardener will tell you, get the soil right. That's what you got, right? You get the growing conditions right, because your aim is, fruit at the end, not just a garden of no weeds. As you were explaining that, though, it did call to mind probably something that every parent has dealt with. If you ever been tired, you walk in to the living room, your kids have been watching TV for like an hour or whatever, been playing video games. You're like, kids, turn it off. We're done. We're done with TV. We're done with video games. Not doing it anymore. Turn it off. And then I don't know what your kids do, Joe, but mine, what they will do if I say turn the TV off, they start following me around like lost puppies. Because all I've told them is to turn off the TV, stop watching TV.
Yeah.
Right. And that's all. So then they just follow me around like they're lost, like they have nothing else to do. Like they don't have a room full of toys to play with. Right. But you're right. This is the image I think that's appropriate when we start talking about, if we tell guys, hey, kill sin, go out, kill sin. And we need to put effort into that. But if we do it just like we're saying, pull weeds or turn the TV off, and we don't give them something to do, something bigger, a bigger purpose in life, and an actual path to get on, and as something to aim for, which is we're aiming for getting on this path of holiness, righteousness. If we don't highlight that, then we've missed the point a little bit, and guys are ultimately going to end up just walking around like lost puppies.
Right. And so that's what we're talking about. I think, we can introduce the rule for this week, and it's just, we'll call it the law of replacement. And it's just the idea that ultimately the only way to kill a sin is to replace a sin. And so to kill a vice, you got to cultivate a virtue. And this is what we need to, help guys think about.
Yeah.
So
do you have, because every week you've given me something from Romans. I assume you have another verse from Romans to give me this week on.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, Romans is where Paul goes through the gospel, right? So if we're going to think about a kind of gospel approach to this, yes. So definitely. So I thought I would point guys this week to Romans chapter 13, starting verse 11 and 12. I'll read these verses. Paul says, besides this, the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light.
Hmm.
And I think there's several things tucked away in this verse that are really helpful for thinking about fighting sin. One of them that's really interesting is the way that Paul says in verse 11 that we know the time, and the idea that night is behind us and the day is at hand. And I think part of what's so powerful about that image is we often think that as Christians, like the fight against sin, we're missing out. But in Paul's mind, like we can see the world as it really is. Like we don't have to be confined to that, stumbling around in the darkness and just doing whatever you can do with no sight. Like we can see what's better. And so it's like knowing this time, he says that what we're meant to do is to put off the works of darkness and to put on the armor of light. And these two things are always related in Paul's mind. Whenever he says that something needs to be put off, he immediately begins shortly thereafter to talk about what needs to be put on. And what we need to see is the connection between this. It's not just that there's bad things and there's good things, but actually part of the process of putting off is putting on. Like it's ultimately about one grand act that we're meant to be doing, which is growing into the likeness of Jesus. And what's really interesting is later on, if you in verse 13, he talks about some sort of typical sins, but then he comes back in verse 14 and he says, put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And what's interesting is that language of put on, it really is the language of get dressed. And so we're meant to get dressed in the Lord Jesus, and his character is what we're meant to display in our life. And so going back to where we started, this is about something much bigger than just let's get rid of our vices. This is about, we want to go into the world and we want the world to see Christ in us, in all of his strengths and virtues, to be growing in these areas as his followers.
Yeah, that's good. I am always a little skeptical, I will say, of guys that come to me and say, I've been struggling with such and such sin, and I'm going to stop. I'm done. Maybe it's I've had an addiction to porn, and I'm cutting that out of my life. Maybe it's anger or pride, whatever it is. I'm stopping. I'm done. And then they end the conversation there. They say, right. I'm finished. I'm gonna quit this thing. And then a week later, I haven't seen a lot of change in some of the basics. Like, okay, they still didn't really come to church. They still haven't really participated in small group that much. Like, not much else in their life has changed aside from the fact that they quit doing the one thing that probably got them in trouble or got them in a bad situation in life, right? I'm always a little skeptical of those guys. Kind of like, this doesn't have long-term, this doesn't have sustainability, right? This isn't going to last. You quit something, but you never really grabbed on to something worthwhile to head for. You put off, but you didn't put on. And I think this is where we can, as groups of men, even look at some of the ways we hold each other accountable. I love accountability questions. I think accountability questions are helpful, but maybe even tweaking some of those. In some senses, what accountability questions do is they ask one another, what did you do? What did you do last week? And you're trying to reflect on what did you do? What if we start asking questions about what will you do? What if we ask one another those kind of questions? Not only what did you do last week that maybe you said you weren't going to do, but what will you do this week? Because that's more of the putting on kind of lifestyle that we as men of God want to live.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. And I think, to put it in terms, I think a lot of guys can understand. I mean, you can think of the guy who, for example, wants to be able to hold his temper a little bit better. Which is probably a noble thing, to have a longer fuse than a shorter fuse. But if you think about it, like, that's just going back to something we talked about a few weeks ago. It's just a kind of defensive thing. Like, I just want to not get angry, when actually, we can push beyond that and think, if we really want to get past that anger that's so explosive, we've got to learn empathy. We've got to be able to look and think, what's the world like from the experience of my child? How do they perceive me? How does my wife perceive me? What does it look like to really enter into their need and to sacrifice my own self-centeredness in order to show kindness to them? Like, there's a whole complex of positive growth that's required that goes well beyond just, having a longer fuse.
Yes. And I think it's important to remember in this too, we're not pitching a lifestyle that's boring or
Right.
dull, right? I love actually, even when you mentioned the garden analogy, what it called to mind was Psalm 1 to me, right? And what we get there is the image of you get the image of two different kind of people. One that's a chaff blowing in the wind. The other that's a tree firmly rooted. And Psalm 1 talks about, well, how do you get delight in the law of the Lord, right? The first verse actually talks about three things not to do, how not to stand, sit, and walk. Don't do these things, but it doesn't end there. There's verse 2 that says, walk and delight in the way of the Lord. And that's, so in other words, this is fun, like, right?
Oh yeah.
Right? When we put on, it's fun.
Yeah. No, I think, if we were still in high school and, we were playing football, who wouldn't want to grow into the likeness of, say, Tom Brady?
Yeah.
Or, I'm gonna go back to one of my favorite running backs, but like a Barry Sanders, think back to like his running style. But what Paul tells us in the passage we read is that we're called to put on the armor of light and to put on the Lord Jesus Christ. So, this is like humanity at its best. Yeah, we're not at all talking about just stripping life of its goodness. We're talking about growing into the character that's most worthy of our esteem, admiration, and long-term pursuit.
That's great. So how then, Joe? Okay, so this, I get it. We need to pursue virtue. What does that even look like?
Yeah, this is where we stumble in yet another difficulty, I think, for guys, because this whole language of putting on, getting dressed, depends upon knowing what you're meant to put on. So I live in Scotland. Formal dress for men here, not a tuxedo. It's not a suit. It's a kilt. And a kilt is not just one thing. First time I wore a kilt, like you've got like 30 things that they give you, ranging from like special socks and shoelaces to like a knife in the sock to like this sporran thing that sometimes got a head of like a fox on it. I mean, it's like piece after piece. And so I was looking at the bed thinking, I don't know how to get dressed. I had to look up a YouTube video to figure out what these things were. And I think that, that what's relevant to guys is if I say grown godliness, a lot of guys aren't going to know what that is, what the positive virtues are that they should be pursuing. And so if their mind goes blank, it's like saying to a guy, get dressed. And he says, I don't even know what I'm supposed to wear.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. First of all, I hope if I ever visit Scotland, I get a kilt. Is that like just automatically, like when you come, that's the welcome gift? Do I get one?
Well, I wish. It is amazing. I will say I used to make fun of it, and then I wore it. It is amazing. It's the most masculine dress that's out there.
No, I've heard it's great. I've got one friend with a kilt, and he swears by it. He thinks it's, but he actually gardens in his kilt, so that's
okay. Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's like when we put these things on, we first have to start by saying, what does this even look like? What are the things that I start with? Let me phrase it this way. If you were to write a manual, give someone a 1-page manual of here's how to start growing in virtue, or here's what to begin pursuing. I don't know. What does that even look like? Where would you start guys off at?
Yeah. First I tell guys, step one is going to be a student of virtue. So for example, if you love watching American football, you are a student of the game, and you pay attention, and over time you can look and you can spot certain formations, and what a good player in each position looks like. We need to have that same attitude with virtue. And so two ways we can grow in this area. One is when you get to a list of character traits in the New Testament. So for example, going back to Colossians 3, which we love in cross training, Paul talks about, putting on compassionate hearts, kindness, meekness, humility, and patience. What we tend to do is lump all that together and say, oh, Paul's telling us to be good. It's like, no, he's saying that there are 5 or 6 specific things we're meant to put on. And so to actually stop, look up those words, get a definition, make it concrete in your head. But with that, here's another thing is look for models. So if you're watching a movie and it doesn't matter what it is, but if you find your heart compelled by like some picture, you might be watching Gladiator. But think about Russell Crowe's character. What is it? Now, I'm not saying everything you admire is going to be good, But if you start looking at the stories, looking at the films in your life, you're going to begin to recognize there's virtue, there's vice. How do I label these things? And so what does courage really look like? What does self-control look like? Who models it really well?
Mm.
And, with movies, I'd say that's where biography is so useful. I mean, because we get examples of heroic Christians that have been remembered because they've had certain character traits. And so, step one, be a student. And then step two is going back to last week, that law of habit, begin to practice, think about who you want to be. And if you get an opportunity to grow in that area, do it. Whether it's courage, whether it's kindness, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's whatever it is, just if you can see, here's this moment, I'm wanting to pull back and feed that vice that's been typical of my life, but I'm going to step out of my comfort zone. And in this moment, I'm going to work against my character and I'm going to practice a new character. And it's that repetition over time that I think begins to shift our direction.
Yeah, it draws me to maybe even a thought exercise because it's this idea of practice. What if we began practicing this and doing this? I think a lot of us may sit back and think, what if every boardroom or every political office were filled with people that were fighting against sin? Okay, that would be, that'd be incredible, right? Or the even better question I think we're asking here is, what if every boardroom, every political office were full of people that were like pursuing virtue, like pursuing like that? Wow, that would be incredible. But to put it more specific for each, what if, my cubicle, what if the cubicle I'm sitting in was full of people that were pursuing virtue? What if I was doing that? What would it look like for me to pursue courage, to pursue honesty, to pursue all of these great things in my workplace? What would my home look like if not only was I fighting against sin? We all know sin ruins boardrooms, political offices, homes, individual lives. We know that. But man, what if I filled my home with the pursuit of these virtues? That's a challenging exercise for sure for each of us, I think.
Yeah. And this is where I think guys should just know, in any book that's talking about character change or habit, even the secular ones will make this point, is the motivational power of identity. Like if you begin to see something and you really identify with it, then you begin to want to act according to that character. And that's exactly anything in Paul's context, put on the Lord Jesus Christ. That in a real sense, that this is who I identify with. How do I see Jesus acting? How do I represent that character where I am? The more we just are filled with kind of a sense of our identity in him, the more we're going to act out of that character as well.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to take some time now to look at maybe applying this to a specific sin. So we've looked at different sins each week just to try to help guys. Look, there are sins that are killing guys out there, right? We can look at things, this is killing me. How do I actually follow through in some of this? So let's talk about greed today and look at what is greed. Let's just start there, actually, before we move on. Give me a definite. You've brought me every week a weird definition, Joe, like something that is not what I would have written down as my definition. So I'm assuming that you've done something as well this week. What is greed?
Yeah, my definition of greed is caring more about stuff than people. So this is where you gotta, and we always want to get to the place where we see and feel the evil of vice, because that will kind of have a repelling force. And so we need to just see is greed and hate. I mean, they're like, they're twins. So, the problem with greed is all of a sudden, rather than people that we're called to love, and we know as Christians are called to serve, there's something else, whether it's money, it could be success, it could be just accumulating stuff. But I actually love that more than people. So now I'm going to sacrifice people so I can have more of whatever this thing is. And that's a really hateful attitude to have.
Yeah, gosh. Okay. I thought this was the one week I wasn't going to be feeling very convicted about this particular sin. I see, okay, let's talk about greed. Here's what I think. Rich people struggle with greed. That's my right. And as long as I'm poor, I'll never struggle with greed. That's my initial thoughts. But you threw people in the mix there and hate, and that that complicated things for me, Joe. Why is it more expansive than that? And how does that, okay, let's then talk about the pursuit of virtue through this. How does it affect the lives of guys?
Yeah. Well, so yeah, let's just keep broadening it for guys. So
Yes.
just to see, money, we know greed can be connected with just accumulating as much money, and in a sense, a kind of more than's needed in sacrificing people for money. But let's think about some other things that guys that may not care about money would struggle with. So, two things that pop into my mind: success and fitness. They're not bad, but it's not hard for the guy to think, okay, I care more about fitness, and I'm gonna, achieve my aspirations to do these triathlons or these marathons or CrossFit at this level.
Mm-hmm.
Now my kids are being sacrificed, and so now that's a greedy spirit. Or same with, you could do something similar with success. And so what we just need to see is that this is a passion that threatens our lives. And so once you see you need to put it off, following what we've talked about, the law of replacement, the question is, what do I need to put on? And there are a few things that we need to plant in that soil in place. Generosity is the obvious one with money, rather than accumulate, give, but let's go with the non-obvious, which I would say sacrifice and contentment kill greed. So I may have a desire, I may have something I would really like, but the truth is that's going to create friction and not allow me to love the people God's put in my life. Am I willing to sacrifice that and be content with what God's given me, and not fulfill all my self-driven aspirations? That's the kind of spirit, that willingness to freely sacrifice what otherwise I might have a right to, because I want to love people. That's the place that the heart will begin to kill the sin of greed.
Yeah, bringing people into this mix, others besides myself, it does expand this in a way that I do think is helpful. Is it okay if I go back to my admiration of the Amish? Is that weird? I'm not saying that they're the perfect. I'm just, so here's, it calls to mind.
I'm sure some of these tools in your garage do not fit, Amish criteria, just so you know.
They do not. Yeah, there's way too much electricity going on in here. But there's a question that every Amish community is a little different, but there's one question that most of them will ask before they introduce something into their community, like electricity or a car or a washing machine. They don't have those things, not because there's like one general rule, hey, you're not allowed to have these. They ask a question for themselves. They say, will this thing, whatever it is, be a hindrance to the people of this community and the purpose of this community? Is this stuff going to get in the way of us being who we are and why we are, basically, is what they're trying to ask. And I admire that about them, because they're saying there's something we could introduce into this community that is probably good, like a washing machine, whatever. There are some communities that have those, but there's some things that you can probably justify. But as you look at it, what if we asked about the iPhone that's just thrown at us? Will the introduction of this into my home, this stuff, will this be something that helps the people fulfill the purpose where we're at? That does make things a little harder to say, ooh, we need to maybe cut back on some things, and then puts us, okay, so what are the things we're going to spend our time with? If we're, cutting out some stuff, where are the people and purpose in our lives, and what are we going to pursue there? So that can be a helpful way, just a question for us to ask. Yeah. And when greed shows its face, we're in whatever realm of life, what are you, if you introduce those things, if you really got that desire fulfilled, what is it going to do to the people in the community and the home and all of that around you?
Yeah. Now that's good. And that's where, there's this being a community of love. So fundamental. I mean, that's what we're meant to grow into, as Christian men, with our families, with our churches, it's not about me. It's about us. It's about God. It's about his love flowing through us and being seen in this world. And so, guys, if we're going to kill greed, all of these sins, ultimately putting on love, the love of Christ, is going to be at the very heart of seeing these sins put to death. Yes,
that's it. So before I close this out, you got anything else that you want to give guys in regards to virtue and pursuing a life of virtue?
I think just one takeaway for each guy to think about. So you're probably aware of the sin that is, wreaking havoc in your life. Ask this week, well, what's the virtue that needs to replace that? Because you maybe haven't seen that. So spend a little time trying to define it. Think about some compelling models of that virtue, and then look for those opportunities, not just to say no, but to say yes to what you're meant to become.
Yeah, that's good. In attachment to that, I was talking to a friend earlier this week actually about us starting to build what I've heard labeled a bookshelf of invisible advisors. And I love that idea of, hey, there are some guys out there there's biographies and such out there of men that have pursued these lives of radical generosity and things like the virtues that I do want to infect my life. What if I had a bookshelf of these invisible advisors of sorts? So men, you can start to even think through that. What are the things I'm reading? How can I let that infect my life? But we hope that you will go forward. Yes, kill sin, but man, bigger than that, we are here to help you train in spiritual fitness and see a life of righteousness that's ahead of you and head on that path. So if you need help, either as an individual or as a group, you can visit our main website, xtrainingministries.com, and you'll see that there's a pathway there for you to start to get on to pursue this life of holiness. And we want to help you out with that. But until next week, I guess we'll see you next time.